This month we're going to be baking 4 blocks, and each block this month is based on the square and a square block. So our first block, we have a red square. It's probably a little bit bigger than 2 inches. We have a gold rectangle, a beige rectangle. Then the pattern says it's a small floral that's red. It is not a floral in your kit. And then a large gold rectangle. So the first thing we're going to do is from our red square, we're going to cut a 1 3/4 inch square. So square up 2 sides and turn it or walk around on 1 3/4. I'm not walking around. So then I have my 1 3/4 mark on this edge and my 1 3/4 inch mark here, and trim. Then from our small gold rectangle, we need 2 2-inch squares. You actually could go a little bit bigger if you want to. We're going to be trimming down afterwards, so it's okay if they're oversized, but I'm going to go ahead and just do the 2-inch. So then we're going to cut our piece 2 inches wide by 4 inches long. So I'm running my 2-inch mark along the long edge, my 4-inch along the short edge. Cut. And then I'm going to move back to my 2-inch mark, and at this point it can be any straight line on my long edges, and cut. And both of these are going to be cut in half once on the diagonal. So we're going to just put our ruler point to point and cut. And the same thing on the other one. So that gives us 4 triangles. Then from our beige, we're going to cut this into 2 2 1/4 inch squares. So 2 1/4 plus times 2 is 4 1/2. So I'm going to cut my strip 2 1/4 wide by 4 1/2 long. So my 2 1/4 mark is now on my long edge, and my 4 1/2 mark is on my short edge. I'm going to cut. I'm going to slide my ruler back to 2 1/4 and cut. And these also are going to be cut in half on the diagonal. So I line it up point to point. If you want to, you can put your 45-degree line on one of your cut edges. Cut. But these will be trimmed down, so if they're not exactly exact, it's not the end of the world. So that gives me 4 more triangles. And then from my red square, which it says is a floral, I'm going to cut 2 2 3/4 inch squares. So that is 5 1/2 inches long if we multiply 2 3/4 times 2. Straighten up 2 edges. Rotate. So it's 2 3/4. So I want my 2 3/4 mark on the long edge and my 5 1/2 mark on the short edge. I didn't mention it, but I did already best press, starch, or sizing all my fabric. If you're doing that, then you'll have wanted to do that before you start cutting. Then I'm going to slide back to my 2 3/4 mark, any straight lines on the long edge, and cut. And these also get cut in half on the diagonal. There. And there. So again, I have 4 triangles. And finally, my big gold rectangle, I need to cut it into 2 3 3/4 inch squares. So that would be 7 1/2 inches long. And straighten up 2 edges. And I want 3 3/4 I'm putting my 3 3/4 mark on my long edge, my 7.5 inch mark on my short edge. Cut and cut. Then I'm going to move my ruler back to the 3 3/4 mark. Again, straight edges on my long edge, my 3 3/4 down here on the short edge. Cut, and this also gets cut in half on the diagonal. To give me 4 triangles. If you've been with me for other First Thursday Mysteries, you know that I love the square squared ruler for square and square units. Unfortunately, all but one of these are odd sizes, so you can't use that ruler. So what we're going to do now is take our square and our smallest gold triangles, and we're going to sew them on to opposite sides. And I like to sew, since my triangles are oversized, with the square on top so that I get the most accurate seam I can on the square. So I'll sew these two onto opposite sides, and then I will press away from the square, and then I will add these two on the remaining 2 sides. And again, press away from the square. I forgot to say that when you're putting your triangles on, you're just visually centering them. Now, if you have a hard time doing it visually, you could always fold your triangle in half and your square in half and find the center. Now, the pattern gives us the measurements for how big our square should be each time, and we are also going to be trimming it down. So for this one, my red square should be 1 1/4. If I put the ruler down on it, I am pretty much right there. Now, if you're off just a hair, I would leave it. The pattern suggests that if you're off, that you tear off your triangles and fix it. The more you play with this, the worse it's going to get, because your triangles along this edge are on the bias. So as long as I'm pretty close and I'm going to be able to trim the whole thing down to the size it's supposed to be, good enough is probably good enough. So we're going to square this up to 2 1/4. So half of 2 1/4 is 1 1/8. So I would want my 1 1/8 mark on my points here, here, here. And I'm going to talk about this ruler a little bit on the third block we do. But this happens to have 1/8 marks. We have 3 different sizes at the store that do that. So I've got my 1/8 mark running through my points. I also want to be sure that I have the 1/4 inch mark. So I want a 1/4 inch seam beyond that mark. So the 1/4 inch is sitting on the point going that way and that way. And when it looks good, I'm going to trim off 2 edges. So remember, this one's going to be 2 1/4. And then I'm going to rotate the block to cut the last 2 last 2 sides. So this time I want to make sure I get it at 2 1/4. So I have my 2 1/4 mark here, my 2 1/4 mark here. Really, if everything was accurate, we should still have our 1 1/8 mark running through our points. You should have a 1/4 inch beyond this point and a 1/4 inch beyond this point, and square it up. So now we're basically treating this like we're starting with a new square in the middle, because we're going to continue adding triangles to the outside edges of this. So the next one that goes on here, you're going to put your beige triangles on. Go opposite sides first, and again, I would be sewing with the square on top, and this time, because I want to hit the intersection where these seams meet, so I hit right on the point. So I'll put those on and press away from the center, and then I'll add these 2 and again press away from the center. I've added my beige triangles on, and now the square that's made up of the gold rectangles should be 1 3/4, and mine's pretty close. So we're going to square this up now to 3 inches. So half of 3 is 1 1/2. So my 1 1/2 line should be running right through the middle, through the points. And again, I want to make sure I have a 1/4 of an inch above the points. So my 1/4 inch mark is sitting right on top of them. And you don't have a lot to trim off here. When you think you've got it, then trim it, and you have committed yourself once you trim those first 2 edges. So for the next cut, we're going to line up our 3-inch mark here on the 2 edges that we just cut. Trim. Trim. So now this becomes our square for the center of our square and a square unit. And our next thing we're going to put on is our red triangles. So again, they go on opposite sides, and I would sew with the square on top because I want to go right through that intersection. Once I've sewn those 2 sides on, I would press out away from the center, and then I will add the last 2 triangles on, and again press out toward the center. And I am visually centering on the triangle. I'm not worrying about folding it. It is slightly oversized, not a lot, but you should have about the same amount hanging out on both ends, the little from the triangle. I've added my bigger red triangles. So now my square that's made up with the beige triangles should be 2.5 inches. So that's pretty good. And we're going to square this square up to 4 inches. So half of 4 is 2. That makes life much easier. That's a whole number. I've got my 2-inch line running through my points here and here. I want to make sure that I have a 1/4 of an inch above those points. And when it looks good, I'm going to trim off 2 sides. And we'll rotate it. And you've committed now because you cut your other 2 sides. We're going to line up our 4-inch mark. And remember, if you're using this ruler, make sure you go all the way out to the edge so you make sure you have the right line. Trim, trim. So now we have one more round to add on to this block. We're going to do the same thing we've been doing. We're going with our big gold triangles, opposite sides. Again, I will be stitching with the square on top so that I can see that intersection and hit it when I'm sewing. Once I have those on, I will press out away from the center, and then I'll come back and add my last 2, and again press out from the center. So I've added my final gold triangles on and pressed away from the center, and now the square made up of my red triangles should be 3.5 inches, and it pretty much is. Mine might be off just a hair. We're going to trim the whole block down to 5.5 inches. So half of 5.5 is 2 3/4. So we want the 2 3/4 marks running through the points of the red square. We also want to make sure that we have the 1/4 of an inch mark beyond the points. And you also want to make sure you're going to be able to get 5.5 inches out of this. So once you have it all lined up, 2 3/4 going through the centers. And yeah, I was looking at the wrong numbers earlier and scared myself. So 5.5. Once you've cut those first 2 cuts, you're committed. So I've got my 5.5 mark here and here. Just make sure you go all the way out to the edge to make sure you really have the right one. And cut. And cut. And there is my finished 16 triangles, which really is a square and a square and a square and a square and a square. Our second block this month is broken sashes. And you have one dark green rectangle. The pattern is calling this one a beige green honeycomb strip, but it's just got little tiny checks in it. And then you have one that it says is a green micro check. It's not, it's little like asterisks or snowflakes and dots in it. And then the last one is a beige print. So the first one we're cutting is our dark green, and we need to cut 4 2 1/4 inch squares from that. So 2 1/4 times 4 is 9 inches. I'm going to clean up 2 edges. Go ahead and turn it. So I want 2 1/4 on my long edge. I want 9 inches on my short edge, so down here. And then cut. And then I'm going to start backing my ruler up in 2 1/4 inch increments. So that would take me to 6 3/4 for the first one. So any long line on my long edges, 6 3/4, cut. Then we're going to back it up to 4 1/2. Again, any line on my long edges, 4 1/2 on my short edge, and cut. Then I'm going to back it up finally to the 2 1/4 to get my last square. Again, I have lines on the long edges, and cut. So that gives us 4 center squares for half square triangles. Then the next piece, we are going to cut this down and also make 4 2 1/4 inch squares out of it. So we're going to cut it exactly the same way. Clean up 2 edges. And then we have the 2 1/4 inch mark along the long edge, 9 inches on the short edge. And cut and cut. And again, we're going to just back it off. So 6 3/4 on the short end. To keep everything straight, we have lines on the long edges. Then we go back to 4 1/2. And then 2 1/4. And all 4 of these squares are going to be cut in half once on the diagonal to give us triangles. So just point to point, just like we did in the last block. And again. I wouldn't be moving them around as much, but my tripod's in the way for where the ruler's sticking out, so. And again, so that gives us 8 triangles. And then from our green, what it's calling a micro check, we're going to cut it into a 2 1/4 inch square. So I straighten 2 edges. Then I just come back and line my 2 1/4 mark up on the 2 sides that I just cleaned up. And this square we are cutting in half on the diagonal. So it gives us 2 triangles. And then from our beige print, which is our big polka dots, we are going to cut this into 3 2 1/4 inch squares. So we're going to cut it, clean cut 2 edges. We're going to line up the 2 1/4 inch mark along the long edge, and then 2 1/4 times 3 is 6 3/4. So 6 3/4 down on that edge. And again, we're cutting 1 1/4 inch squares from this, so we'll back up to the 4 1/2 inch mark on the short end. And then to the 2 1/4 inch mark, not 2 1/4, not 2 1/2, 2 1/4, and cut. And these 3 squares also are cut in half on the diagonal. To give us 6 triangles. For this block, we're actually going to make 4 square and a square units, and there's going to be 2 of each color variation. So the first one we're going to do is our dark green square in the middle. We're going to use all 8 of our beige green honeycomb strip is what she's calling it, but it's our little tiny checks. So we're going to make it just like we did in the last one. We're going to sew on 2 triangles on opposite sides, and I do like to work with the square on top when I'm sewing. Press toward the triangles, and then we'll sew the remaining 2 on. So we're going to make 2 units just like that. So I've sewn and pressed these units. Again, I'm pressing toward the outside. And this one, I need to check that center square, and it should be 1 3/4. So if I put this on here, mine is pretty much there. So my 1 3/4 mark is there and there. And again, if it's off just a hair, I would not tear it out to redo it. We're going to save this to trim it down until all of our square and a square units are finished for this block. So the next 2, we're going to again use our center dark green. On one side, you're going to put what the pattern is calling the green micro check, but ours is those little tiny dots. And then the other 3 sides, well, when you're putting it together, you're going to go opposite sides like this. And then after you have sewn those on and pressed out toward the center, again, I'm stitching with the square on top because that keeps everything more accurate. I'm going to add these last 2 sides and again press out away from the center. So this is what that block looks like after I've stitched it. And again, that center square, just double check it, should be 1 3/4 inches, and mine's close enough. I have all 4 of my square and a square units made, and I've already trimmed 3 of them off camera because they're all going to be trimmed exactly the same way. So we've already checked to make sure that our dark green is 1 3/4 in the center, and we're going to trim these guys down to 3 inches. So half of 3 is 1 1/2, so I'm putting my 1 1/2 mark into the points. And this ruler, it doesn't go straight across because it is a square ruler, so it's making little squares. So I'm also checking, in addition to having my 1 1/2 going this way, I have my 1/4 inch mark right there on the tip so that I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm also checking that I'm actually going to get a 3 inch square by checking on the 2 sides that I won't be cutting. So when you have it all lined up, you're going to cut 2 sides. Then we're going to rotate it. And once you've cut those 2 sides, you're pretty much committed. So now we are going to line up our 3 inch mark, and with this ruler, because of all the 1/8 inch marks, you really want to check the outside edge to make sure you're lining up with what you think you are. So 3 and 3. Trim and trim. And now we're ready to put this block together. So the ones with 3 colors go on opposite sides, with our green going in toward the middle. And then our other 2 pieces here, so we're going to put them together in a 4 patch. We'll put 2 rows and 2 rows together. Then you are going to press to one side. So if you press toward the one that has the light green, do it on both of them. And then we'll put those 2 together to finish off our 4 patch. The pattern actually says press the seams open, so if you would rather do that, you can. Here's the finished broken sash block. I forgot when I was telling you to put it together to tell you really your points should be your matching point, and then when you put the 2 rows together, the center as well. I did press the seams open, because if I had tried to press them to one side, I was getting too much bulk in one corner or the other. For the economy block, we have 4 pieces of fabric: a green strip, a purple strip, an orange strip, and a green square. Now, I've already been using this ruler in this video. It is an Itty Bitty Eights, or Itty Bitty Eights from Creative Grids. This one's a 6.5 inch square. There's also a 3x7 inch ruler and I'm not seeing the measurements right off the top of my head, a 15 by 5 inch ruler. All of them have 1/8 inch marks, and they vary from a lot of the other rulers, because this one, it just has the lines continuing on in the 1/4 inch increments, while this one, it has the 1/8 inch increments. So some of them are in white, some of them are in black, but it helps you to be more accurate when you're cutting 1/8 inch measurements. Our green strip is going to be cut down to 2 1/8 inches wide, and really the longer ruler would work better for that. I'm not going to open all of them for this video though, so I'm just going to use a square that I've already been using. I folded my green strip in half so that I could cut it all at once. So I'm just lining up a line on my fold. I'm going to clean cut 2 edges. And then I'm going to rotate it, and I want it 2 1/8 wide, and we're going to be cutting 4 2 1/8 inch squares. So since I have this folded in half, that means I need a 4 1/4 inch long piece. If I was doing it with a long ruler, it would be 8.5 inches. So 2 1/8, and there's my 1/8 inch mark right there, and 2 1/8 times 2 is 4 1/4. So I've got my 1/8 inch mark out here, my 2 1/8 inch mark here, my 4 1/4 on the short edge, and cut. And since I'm having this doubled, remember, I'm cutting 2 at a time. Then I'm going to slide my ruler back to the 2 1/8 inch mark down here on the short edge. Any line on the long edge, and cut. So that gives me 4 2 1/8 inch squares that are going to be the centers. From my purple strip, I need to cut 8 2 1/4 inch squares. This is a long strip. It's half the width of the fabric. So again, I have it folded in half, and I've switched back to a longer ruler. If you bought the longer 1/8 one, that would certainly work. So I'm going to trim up 2 sides carefully. Either flip it over or you could walk around. I'm going to cut it down to 2 1/4 wide, so do double check if the numbers aren't sticking in your head. And because I have this doubled, 2 1/4 times 4 would be 8, it would be 9 inches. So if I cut it off at 9, this is scrap. There is enough there that you could actually cut another one if you make a mistake. And then we're going to back up in 2 1/4 inch increments. So the next one would be 6 3/4. Then 4 1/2. And 2 1/4. And These are all going to be cut in half, and since I have them doubled, I'm going to just gently move them apart and still cut them doubled. We're going to cut them in half on the diagonal so that we get 16 triangles. Okay, and then we have our orange strip to cut. And from that, we're going to cut it 1 inch wide and cut 4 2 3/4 inch long rectangles out of it. So that is 11 inches. So I have a little bit of variety in color here, so you could pick one side or the other. I'm cutting a 1 inch wide strip from this. So I'm going to straighten up. I'm going to kind of get mine two-toned. And I don't know that all of you will have that much distinction in yours. Turn it around or walk around. So we want it to be 11 inches long by 1 inch wide. So I have my 1 inch line on the long edge. And my 11 inch on the short. We are going to back our ruler off to 8 1/4. So any long line along the long edges, 8 1/4 on my short end cut. Then I'm going to back it up to 5 1/2. Any long line on the long edge, 5 1/2 down here. And then finally to 2 3/4. Finally, from my green square, I'm going to cut a 1 inch square. So just straighten up 2 edges. Line up your 1 inch mark on the 2 sides that you just cleaned up and cut. We'll be making, 4 square and square units exactly like this. So you're going to start with your green center and you'll put 4 purple triangles around the edges. So we'll sew 2 on opposite sides. We are visually centering with the square on top. Once we've sewn those 2 on, we're going to press away from the center and add the next 2 on the remaining 2 sides, press away from the center. I have my 4 square and square units finished, and I have already trimmed down 3 of them. They're all trimmed exactly the same way. We need to check our center square and make sure that it's 1 5/8 inches, and I know this is a dark square, so it's probably going to be a little bit hard to see on camera. But mine is pretty close enough. And now we're going to trim this down to 2 3/4. Well, half of 2 3/4 is 1 3/8. So I'm going to line my 1 3/8 mark up with the center of the points. So I'm centering them on the points, and I want to make sure I have a 1/4 inch beyond. We're going to trim it down to 2 3/4, so I can check over here to make sure there's going to be a 1/4 inch, and here as well. And when you have it centered as well as you can, I'm going to trim off 2 sides, rotate, and now you have committed. So we're going to do 2 3/4. That's the white line on this ruler. I'm lining it up with my previous cut edges and trim. And now I'm ready to sew this block together. This is going to be an uneven 9 patch like we did last month a lot. So I'm going to sew an orange strip between pairs of the purple. Then my green's going to go in the center, and I will add orange strips to both sides of that, and I have misplaced one, so that's what it would look like in rows. After I sewed my rows together, I pressed everything toward the orange. So on the top and bottom row, in toward the center, on the middle row, out away from the center. And now all I have left to do is sew the rows together. And my matching points are here and here, here and here, here and here, here and here. Here's my finished economy block. I did not pop the seams for pressing because it would have pushed the seams out toward the square and square units. So I pressed in toward the orange so that the bulk was not on the points for the square and square units. For the new album block, the pattern says you have 2 pieces of blue and 2 pieces of red. You do not, you have 1 of each, but they are big enough to cut the other pieces out of it, no problem. So we're going to start with our blueprint. And the first thing we were supposed to cut from the blue was a square that was exactly 2 5/8 inches. So I'm going to cut off a piece that's just a little bit bigger than 2 5/8 so that I can square it up. And now I'm going to square, well, I want to see where the flags are in mine, so 2 5/8, so I ran all the way out to the edge. There's my 5/8 mark, there's my 5/8 mark, and I'm getting some flags in there that are sort of, doesn't matter whether they're centered or not, it's an all over print. And then I have one more side to cut. 2 5/8 square. So that's going to be my center on the square and a square unit. Then the next thing the pattern has you cut is you want 2 2.5-inch squares, which would be 5 inches. We added them together. And my other way is going to be this way. So you will want to cut your 2.5 inches off the long edge, not the short edge. So maybe I should have divided it for you. And 2.5 inches times 2 is 5. So I'm lining up long edges, cutting off my 5-inch piece. This is scrap. I'm going to back up to the 2.5-inch mark. Cut. And both of those are cut in half on the diagonal to make 4 triangles. And then we're going to go back to our blue piece again, cut it down to 3.5 inches wide. Let's go ahead and square up that end. And rather than doing the math, because my brain is getting tired, I'm going to cut a 3.5-inch square off of one end. And then I need 2 1.5 by 3.5-inch pieces. So if I add 1.5 together twice, or 1.5 times 2, that gives me 3 inches. And then I can back off to the 1.5, which will give me 2 1.5 by 3.5-inch rectangles. Finally, I'm going back to my long piece of red that I have left. I'm going to trim it down to 1.5 inches wide. This is the edge that I had already cut. And then I'm going to cut it into 2 3.5-inch. I'm going to cut 2 3.5-inch rectangles from that. So 3.5 times 2 is 7. Cut and move back to the 3.5 inch mark, lining up lines with my long edge, and cut. So the first thing we're going to do to put this block together is the small blue square that we cut is going to be the center of our square and a square unit. And we're going to take the red triangles and put it on 4 sides, just like we've done on every other one. So again, I'm going to sew 2 opposite sides. I'm sewing with the square on the top because that's the most accurate, pressing away from the center or toward the triangles. Once I've done that, I add the other 2. I am centering visually, and after I've sewn those on, again I'm pressing away from the triangle. I've made my square and a square unit, and my center square should be 2 1/8 inches, and it's pretty much there. So we're going to trim this one down to 3.5 inches. Half of 3.5 is 1 3/4. So I'm going to put my 1 3/4 mark on the points here and here, and you kind of just have to eyeball it that it's going here. It is, and here. We want to make sure we have 1/4 inch beyond that 1/8 inch mark. We're trimming the whole thing down to 3.5. I have enough to do it all the way around. This doesn't have a lot extra. And once you've committed to your first cut, your second one is at the 3.5 mark, so do look all the way out to the edge of the ruler. And then cut. We're going to set this aside while we work on something else. We're going to take our 3.5 inch square that we cut, and our 2 red strips are 1.5 by 3.5. We're going to sew those red strips to opposite sides of the 3.5 inch square. We're going to press toward the blue after we sew these on the 2 ends. Oops. And there, that's how it looks since I was not zoomed out far enough. Opposite sides. Okay, I've sewn my red on 2 opposite sides. Now I'm going to cut 2 1.5 inch strips from here. And it is wide enough that you can clean up your edge. So I put lines on my seams so I keep everything straight, as well as on the outside ends. 1.5 times 2 is 3. So again, I'm lining up lines on my ends and on my seams, and my 3 inch mark is over here on the long edge. Cut. And then back it off to 1.5 inches. And now go back to our square and a square unit and put our 2 blue rectangles on opposite sides. When we finish those, we're going to press toward the blue, and then we come back and add these to the 2 other sides to finish it off. Here's the completed new album block. I did press away from the center on the final seam as well. I did consider popping the seams, but if I had done that, it was going to fold back on the points of the square and a square. So in this case, it was better not to pop the seams.